My name is Grace Thompson, and I used to think silence was a virtue. I believed it was strength, discipline, obedience. But now I know better. Now I know silence is how they keep you, how they train you to doubt your own instincts, to smile when you're aching, to nod when every part of you is screaming no. I wasn't born into the world of Jehovah's Witnesses. I was absorbed into it. My mother joined when I was 5, broken, vulnerable, looking for purpose after my father walked out on us. She was told it was the truth, the only truth, and she clung to it like a life raft in a storm. And I followed. I learned quickly that questions were dangerous, that emotions were suspect, that love had rules, and if you broke them, you'd be alone. By the time I was 10, I knew how to sit still for 2-hour meetings, how to memorize verses, how to smile at people who told me the world was ending. I was praised for my obedience, but what they never saw was how I cried myself to sleep at night, not because I didn't believe, but because I was terrified I wasn't good enough, that Jehovah would see through my smile and find me lacking. That kind of fear. It lives in your bones, and it followed me into adulthood. I married a brother from our congregation at 20. We were the perfect couple, devoted, quiet, always present at the meetings. We studied together, prayed together. We even pioneered together. But I never told him about the night I sat in my room at 16, clutching a pillow and whispering to God, "Please, just let me disappear." Because I had broken a rule. I had kissed someone I wasn't supposed to, a boy who wasn't baptized, and even though nothing more had happened, the guilt consumed me. I confessed. I repented. I was forgiven. But something inside me never healed. And now, years later, I'm ready to talk. Because if I don't, who will? I grew up in a small town in Alabama, where Sunday mornings meant dressing up and heading to the Kingdom Hall. My parents were devoted Jehovah's Witnesses, quiet, obedient, and absolutely convinced that the world outside was a threat to our salvation. From the time I could walk, I was told that questioning was dangerous, that everyone outside was lost, that loyalty to the congregation was loyalty to God. So I didn't question. I became the perfect daughter, the perfect believer. By the time I was a teenager, I was already knocking on doors, handing out magazines I hadn't even read. I recited verses, smiled politely, and nodded whenever the elders spoke, never allowing myself to wonder if their words made sense. But something inside me was always unsettled, like a small voice hiding behind my ribs, whispering that something was off. I ignored it. For years. Then came the day that changed everything. I was 23, married, newly pregnant, sitting in the back row of a congregation meeting when a woman, shaking and pale, stood up and began to cry. Her daughter, just 6 years old, had told her something unspeakable, something no child should ever have to say, and the man responsible was her husband, a respected brother in the congregation. The elders hushed her, told her to sit down, that this was not the place, that Jehovah would handle it. They didn't call the police. They told her to forgive him. I felt something inside me split open. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. All I could think about was the baby growing inside me, and what kind of world I was bringing them into. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence in my home. My husband, deeply faithful, said nothing. He didn't ask if I was okay, didn't mention what happened at the meeting. And I didn't bring it up, because I was afraid, not of God, but of what would happen if I dared to speak. In the days that followed, I tried to bury it. I went to the meetings. I smiled. I bowed my head during prayer. But every time I looked at another child in the congregation, I felt sick. And that voice inside me, the one I'd ignored since I was a girl, it started to scream. I thought maybe I was being too emotional. Maybe it really was a spiritual test. That's what we were always told, right? Satan is cunning. He uses emotion to mislead. So I stayed silent. I forced myself to obey. But silence has a weight to it, a heaviness that presses against your chest and refuses to let you breathe. One evening, after yet another meeting where no one mentioned what had happened, I walked into my bedroom and found myself shaking. I stared at my reflection, my eyes hollow and tired, and I said aloud just once, "What if they're wrong?" It was the first time I allowed myself to think it, and the moment I did, I felt terrified and free. But I wasn't ready to act, not yet. Instead, I buried myself deeper into the truth, as they called it. I pioneered. I volunteered for everything. I studied harder. I hoped that by doing more, I'd stop feeling less. Then one night, during a private meeting with the elders, a teenage boy came forward. He was barely 17, pale, trembling, barely able to speak. He said he had thoughts, that he'd tried to fight them, that he was scared. He hadn't acted on anything. He hadn't hurt anyone. He was just scared of what he was feeling. I watched as the elders told him those feelings were unnatural, that they were a test from Jehovah, that he needed to pray harder, that if he failed, it could mean his eternal life. He nodded. He apologized. He left. And I never saw him again. That night I wept alone in my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to the world. It was then I realized we weren't saving anyone. We were breaking them. After that night, the images wouldn't leave me. The boy's voice, his shame, his desperation to be fixed before it was too late, and the way no one flinched. Not the elders, not the congregation. Certainly not me. I was complicit. Again. And the silence inside me turned into a roar. At home, I started waking up at 3 a.m. with my chest burning. I'd sit on the edge of the bed in the dark, staring at my sleeping husband, wondering how we ended up here, living a life built on fear, disguised as faith. One morning, while getting our son dressed for school, he asked me why we never celebrated his birthday. I froze. How do you explain to a child that his joy had been labeled disobedience? That morning, as I watched him tie his shoes and look up at me with those trusting eyes, something cracked inside. What were we passing on? Were we teaching him love or submission? And then I remembered her, the little girl from months ago, her voice trembling, her innocence torn apart, and no one standing up for her. Not even me. That memory, her voice became a ghost. It followed me through every meeting, every conversation, every moment I tried to pretend I still believed. And then came the worst one. A sister, only 19, was summoned to a judicial committee. Her crime? Falling in love with someone outside the organization. He wasn't abusive. He wasn't dangerous. He simply wasn't one of us. We sat in a windowless room, 3 men on one side, and her, small, silent, staring at the floor, on the other. They asked if she repented, if she would cut contact, if she was willing to erase someone she loved, just to stay. She whispered yes, but her eyes told another story. And when the decision came, expulsion, I didn't object. I didn't say a word. I just signed the paper and watched her leave alone. Her parents didn't even look at her. And I couldn't breathe, because I knew then I wasn't only losing faith. I was losing myself. The silence after her departure was unbearable. Not just in the Kingdom Hall, but inside me. It was the kind of silence that screams, that presses against your ribs and makes it hard to breathe. I went home that evening and stood in the shower until the water ran cold. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stood there, still, numb, and ashamed. How many times had I been on the other side of that table? How many signatures like that had I given over the years, believing I was doing what was right? But that night, I didn't feel righteous. I felt hollow. And then, as if the universe was watching, the elders called a special meeting. This time, the person under scrutiny was me. They said they'd noticed my absence from field service, that my answers during the meetings weren't as wholehearted as they used to be, that my spirit seemed troubled. They weren't wrong. But when they asked me what was going on, I didn't tell them about the nights I spent awake, haunted by the silence we were all trained to keep. I didn't tell them that every child's question, every woman's tears, had begun to echo in my soul, louder than any Watchtower article ever could. Instead, I told them I was tired, that I just needed time. One of them leaned forward and smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, and said, "Doubt is Satan's favorite weapon." I smiled back, but inside, I broke. They didn't expel me, not yet, but they were watching me closely. I could feel it, the sideways glances, the sudden coolness from sisters who used to call daily, the unspoken message, "You're no longer one of us." And in a way, they were right, because something inside me had shifted permanently. That night, I opened my laptop and typed into a search bar for the first time in years, former Jehovah's Witness stories. And what I found saved me. I spent hours reading the stories of people who had walked away. Women like me, mothers, daughters, sisters, each one carrying wounds I recognized but had never dared name. Some had left quietly. Others had been dragged through public humiliation. But all of them, in their own way, had chosen truth over silence. And their words, they felt like lifelines. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't alone. I started journaling again, something I hadn't done since I was a teenager. Every night after my son went to bed, I'd sit at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, writing things I couldn't say out loud. At first, it was just fragments. I don't believe this anymore. I miss God, but not this version of him. I feel like I'm disappearing. And then, slowly, the fragments became full thoughts, full pages. I wrote about the moment I first felt doubt, about the guilt that followed me like a shadow, about how I longed to dance at weddings, celebrate birthdays, light candles on Christmas, even if it was just for the joy of seeing my son smile. The more I wrote, the more I remembered who I used to be, before the doctrines, before the shame, before the silence. I remembered laughing without fear, asking questions without punishment, dreaming beyond the walls of our small watchful world. One night I looked up from my journal and saw my reflection in the kitchen window. And for the first time in years, I didn't see a witness. I saw a woman. Tired, yes, but alive. And I knew something was changing. I started pulling away, little by little. I stopped commenting during meetings. I declined invitations to gatherings. I let my field service hours drop. I didn't make a scene. I didn't post on social media. I didn't argue. I just stopped pretending. And with each quiet step away, the fear began to loosen its grip. Not all at once, but enough that I could breathe again. Enough that I could finally imagine a different life. Not a perfect one, but one where I was free. It was a Sunday morning when I made my quiet rebellion. My husband had already left for the Kingdom Hall with our son, and I sat alone on the edge of the bed, holding the dress I always wore to meetings. It felt heavier than usual, like it carried every expectation, every rule, every memory I was trying to shed. I hung it back in the closet. Then I sat down on the living room couch and waited. No dramatic music, no lightning bolt of courage, just silence and the soft hum of the world outside. For the first time in years, I wasn't rushing to pretend. I wasn't forcing myself to fit a mold that never really held me. When they came back, he looked at me like I was broken, like the woman he married had disappeared. I didn't have the words yet to explain that maybe she had, because that version of me wasn't real. She was survival. She was compliance. And now, she was gone. The days that followed were tense. He stopped speaking to me unless it was necessary. He prayed louder at dinner. He left Watchtower articles on the kitchen counter as if they might magically pull me back. But I didn't respond. I was still too raw, too afraid to fight. But the war had already begun. Quietly, inside. Then, one afternoon, my son asked if we were going to the hall that weekend. I looked into his small, trusting eyes and felt the tears rise before I could stop them. How do you explain to a child that the path his parents walked together had split, and that you were the one walking away? I told him no. Not this time. He didn't ask why. He just nodded and went back to coloring, like it was the most ordinary answer in the world. But to me, it was sacred. It was the first thread I pulled from the tapestry of our lives, and I knew that, eventually, the whole thing would unravel. That night I lay awake again, my chest heavy but not from guilt. This time, it was something else. Grief. Not just for the faith I was losing, but for all the parts of me that had been buried beneath it. The laughter I'd stifled, the holidays I'd missed, the friendships I'd let die on the altar of obedience. Leaving wasn't just about escaping control. It was about reclaiming all the parts of myself I'd been taught to fear. And even though I didn't know what came next, I knew this. I wasn't going back. I started walking in the mornings. Not for exercise, really. Just to get away from the silence inside the house. I'd pass the same houses I used to knock on as a witness, offering magazines and polished smiles, warning of Armageddon like it was just around the corner. Now, I passed those houses like a ghost, unseen, unsure of who I was becoming. Each step was a prayer I didn't know how to say anymore. One day I ended up sitting at a small park bench near the elementary school. The children were at recess, their laughter like wind chimes in the distance. And I realized I hadn't heard that kind of joy in years. Real, unfiltered, unrepentant joy. We were never allowed to just be happy without attaching a scripture to it. Every celebration had a consequence. Every pleasure was a potential sin. That's when I started crying. Right there on the bench, in front of strangers who probably thought I'd lost someone. And they weren't wrong. I had lost someone. Me. I had disappeared behind years of submission, silence, and performance. Behind a name tag that said, Pioneer. Behind dresses I never liked. Behind words I never believed. When I got home, I opened a box I hadn't touched in over a decade. Inside were photos from college. The short year I'd spent there before my parents pulled me out, saying higher education was dangerous for a Christian woman. There was a picture of me, smiling, holding a book on philosophy, eyes bright and unaware of what was coming. I stared at her for a long time. That night, I dreamed of her. We were sitting together, older me and younger me, side by side on that same bench. She looked at me and asked, "Why did we stop dreaming?" And I didn't have an answer. But when I woke up, I knew I had to try to remember who she was, who I was, before the rules, before the shame, before I was told my only value was obedience. It wasn't easy. Even little things, like listening to music I'd once labeled worldly, or reading novels with characters who questioned everything, felt rebellious. But rebellion, I realized, wasn't loud. Sometimes it looked like silence. Sometimes it looked like a woman sitting alone in her kitchen, lighting a candle for no reason, except that it brought her peace. And sometimes it looked like hope. The next shift was quiet, not dramatic, not loud, just a slow unraveling. I stopped commenting during meetings. I stopped raising my hand. I stopped pretending to agree when every fiber of me wanted to scream. At first, no one said anything. But in a place like that, silence doesn't go unnoticed. It's catalogued, watched, judged. I remember one Sunday, a sister approached me after the meeting. Her name was Elaine, soft-spoken, kind eyes, always with a casserole dish in her arms. She smiled and said, "We've missed your comments, Grace. Is everything okay?" I smiled back and lied. "Oh, yes. Just tired. You know how it is." But she didn't know, and I couldn't say it, because how do you tell someone that you're grieving a version of God you thought you knew? How do you explain that the God you were taught to worship feels more like a prison guard than a father? At home, I tried to keep things together. I cooked, I cleaned, I played the role. But my husband could sense it. He started asking questions. Not the kind that seek to understand. No, the kind that monitor. The kind that tighten the leash. "Are you reading your watchtower? Did you prepare your study? Why didn't you mention Jehovah in your prayer?" It became a game of evasion, of dodging and smiling and saying just enough to pass. Until one night he found a tab open on my computer. Religious Trauma Recovery. He didn't say anything. He just closed the laptop and walked out of the room. That silence was louder than any accusation. The next morning there was a Watchtower magazine on my pillow. No note, no words, just a silent warning. I felt nauseous. Not from fear, but from knowing that my thoughts were no longer mine, that I was being watched even in the quiet of my own home. That evening I drove to the edge of town and sat in my car for hours, just breathing, just existing without expectation. And for the first time in years, I prayed. Not the way I was taught, no dear Jehovah, no script, just a whisper into the dark. "Please, help me remember who I am." There was no answer, but for the first time, it felt like someone was listening. The next day, I started making plans, not grand ones, not escape routes, just tiny rebellions. I stopped underlining paragraphs in the watchtower. I let my mind wander during prayers. I skipped a service meeting, told them I had a headache. No one questioned it. Not at first. But I did. I questioned everything. I started writing again. Something I hadn't done since I was a girl. Not in a diary. Not even in full sentences. Just fragments. Words that had been locked away, waiting to breathe. Control isn't love. Fear isn't faith. Truth doesn't punish questions. One night, I found myself standing in front of the mirror for what felt like hours. Not doing anything, just looking at my face. My real face, no fake smile, no pretending. Just me. And I realized I didn't recognize the woman staring back, because she wasn't a witness. She was a prisoner dressed in modest skirts and painted on conviction, and she was ready to leave. But I didn't know how. The doctrine is a net, finely woven and invisible until you try to move. It clings to your thoughts, your family, your past, your afterlife. Every step away feels like a betrayal, not just to the people you love, but to the God you were taught would punish you for doubting. So I stayed, just a little longer, but I started paying attention. I watched how the sisters looked over their shoulders before speaking. I listened to how often the brothers used fear as a teaching tool. I noticed how young people faked smiles, while their eyes told stories they weren't allowed to speak. And I knew. I wasn't alone. There were others, hiding in plain sight, surviving one meeting at a time. We passed each other like ghosts, too afraid to speak, too broken to stay silent. Then came the final fracture. It was a Tuesday evening, a judicial announcement. They called her name, a young woman I'd studied the Bible with for years. Her sin wasn't listed. It never is. Just her name, followed by, is no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses. No chance to speak, no goodbye, just erasure. People gasped. Some looked down. Others shook their heads in disappointment. I didn't react. I sat frozen, because I knew something they didn't. She didn't leave Jehovah. She left them. And for the first time, I wanted to follow. I kept thinking about her, how her name had been spoken like a warning, how quickly people turned the page as if she'd never existed. 1 week she was a sister, and the next, a shadow, a cautionary tale. I imagined her packing her things, facing her parents' silence, the loneliness that must have wrapped around her like winter air, and all because she chose to walk toward freedom. Would they do the same to me? Would my family, my husband, my parents, my lifelong friends cut me off, erase me, pretend I never mattered, if I spoke my truth? The fear gripped me like it did when I was a child, when I first learned that unconditional love came with conditions. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about leaving. It was in everything I did. Brushing my teeth, washing dishes, folding laundry. The thought hovered, constant and unshakable. What if I just walked away? But leaving the organization wasn't like leaving a job or moving towns. It meant death. Not literal, but spiritual death. That's how they framed it. You'll die at Armageddon. You'll never see your loved ones again. You'll be alone. They programmed you to believe that disobedience meant extinction, not just of your body, but your soul. But in that moment, I realized something radical. I was already dying, not in fire or judgment, but in silence, in complicity, in the erosion of who I was meant to be. I was fading inside a life that demanded obedience over honesty, conformity over conscience. One morning while driving to the grocery store, I passed a small church. Nothing special, just a white building with peeling paint and a crooked sign out front that said, "Come as you are." I pulled over. I didn't go in. I didn't speak to anyone. I just sat in my car, staring at those words like they were a message written just for me. Come as you are. Not as you're told to be. Not as you pretend to be, but as you are. For the first time in decades, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a place in the world for the real me. Not the witness, not the wife, not the obedient woman in the second row. Just me. And once that thought took root, there was no going back. I didn't leave right away. That would have been too easy, too neat. Life doesn't unravel like that, not when your roots are buried deep in decades of doctrine, fear, and the illusion of belonging. Instead, I started pulling back, slowly. I stopped raising my hand at meetings. I stopped volunteering for the ministry. I began to linger in the back row, near the door, like someone waiting to escape. And I watched, carefully, as people noticed. It didn't take long. The sisters stopped calling. The invitations faded. Smiles became nods. Nods became glances. Glances became nothing. I had become invisible. At first, the silence hurt. Then it clarified. Their love had always been conditional. But what broke me wasn't the coldness. It was the way my husband looked at me, as if I had betrayed him, as if the woman he married had suddenly been replaced by a stranger. He asked me why I wasn't trying harder. He said I was letting Satan plant seeds in my heart. And maybe I was. But if those seeds were doubt, then what grew from them was truth. One night, we argued. Not loudly, not violently, but painfully. The kind of argument where nothing is thrown, yet everything shatters. I told him I couldn't pretend anymore, that I was done playing a role just to keep people comfortable, that I needed to find God without the noise, without the watchtower. He said I was lost. I said I was finally finding myself. After that, he withdrew even more. We became two ghosts haunting the same house, polite, cold, afraid to touch the truth between us. And all the while, I kept writing. Late at night. Letters I never sent. Journal entries I hid beneath the floorboards. Words that tasted like freedom and burned like fire. I wrote about the girl I used to be, about the woman I was becoming, about the faith I once had and the pain it left behind. But mostly, I wrote about silence, the kind that wraps around your throat like a ribbon, the kind that teaches you to smile while you're dying inside, the kind that is passed from mother to daughter like a family heirloom. And I promised myself, if I ever got out, I would break that silence. I wouldn't pass it on. I wouldn't teach my children that obedience was more valuable than their voice. I wouldn't teach them that love disappears when you start asking questions. I would be different. And one night, staring into my bathroom mirror, I whispered it out loud for the first time. I don't belong here anymore. Saying it out loud didn't change my life overnight. The world didn't shift. No dramatic thunderclap. No flashing sign from the heavens. Just me, staring at myself in the mirror, with red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands, breathing the weight of that sentence. I don't belong here anymore. It echoed in the silence like a secret finally freed. But leaving isn't just about walking out the door, especially not when the door is in your soul. It's about unlearning, untangling. It's about mourning something that hurt you and missing it anyway. I didn't pack a suitcase and vanish. I didn't make an announcement. I just stopped showing up. At first, no one called. Then the elders did. First one, then two. They left messages like, "We're concerned about your spiritual health," and "We miss your presence in the congregation." But what they really meant was, "We see you slipping, and it scares us." I didn't respond. A week later, two sisters came by unannounced. One brought cookies. The other held her Bible like a shield. They sat in my living room and said all the things I used to say to others. "We love you. We're worried about you. Jehovah never abandons those who are faithful." I smiled. I nodded. I told them I appreciated the visit. But inside I was screaming. They didn't ask me why I left. They didn't ask what happened. Because deep down, they didn't want to know. Knowing would mean confronting the cracks, and the cracks were everywhere. After they left, I stood by the window and watched their car drive away. And then, for the first time in a long time, I prayed. Not to Jehovah, not to the God they gave me in books and meetings and guilt-soaked doctrine. I prayed to the God I hoped existed, the one who sees the child hidden behind the doctrine, the mother trying to protect her son, the woman who stayed quiet too long. I didn't use fancy words. I didn't quote scripture. I just whispered, "If you're out there, help me not to disappear." Because that's what I felt like I was doing. Disappearing. Fading into the shadows of a life that had never really been mine. That night I took off my wedding ring. Not because I stopped loving him, but because I finally started loving me. I placed it gently on the dresser, a symbol of the life I was stepping out of, a silent goodbye to a version of myself that had spent too long in chains, dressed up as salvation. And I didn't cry. I breathed. For the first time in years, I breathed. The days that followed felt like walking barefoot on broken glass. There's a strange kind of loneliness that comes when you leave a world that trained you to believe it was the only safe place. It's not just the loss of people. It's the loss of language, of rhythm, of certainty. I didn't know how to exist outside the walls that raised me. Simple things, checking the mail, grocery shopping, even smiling at strangers, felt like acts of rebellion. My body moved through the world, but my heart lagged behind, tethered to decades of conditioning. Every night I sat on the edge of my bed and tried to write letters I'd never send, to the elders, to my mother, to myself at 16. Why didn't you run when you had the chance? Why did you stay so long? Why are you still afraid? But I knew the answer, because they taught us that love was conditional, that belonging was a privilege we had to earn, that doubt was poison, and obedience was salvation. And even when I walked away, those roots clung to me like vines. One morning I got a letter in the mail, a formal one, from the congregation. Disfellowshipped. No phone call, no conversation, just a document, a verdict. They'd decided that my silence was defiance, that my absence was rebellion, that my questions made me dangerous. I held the letter in my hands for a long time. Not because I cared about their decision, but because I remembered what that word meant, shunned, erased, dead to them. And yet, I felt nothing. No tears, no panic. Just this strange, quiet clarity. They could take away my seat in the Kingdom Hall. They could strike my name from their lists. But they couldn't take my truth. They couldn't take the nights I stayed up protecting my son's heart. They couldn't take the moment I looked in the mirror and said, "Enough." They couldn't take the years I lost, or the voice I finally found. That night I lit a candle. I sat at my kitchen table, the letter folded beside me like a ghost of a life that no longer belonged to me. I stared at the flame, steady and warm, and whispered the name of every person I'd failed to stand up for. The little girl from the meeting, the teenage boy with too much fear in his eyes, the 19-year-old cast aside for loving the wrong person. And then I whispered my own name, because I deserved to be remembered too. When I finally started talking, really talking about what I went through, I expected judgment, I expected pushback, maybe even cruelty. But what I didn't expect was for the silence to break. It started quietly. A comment under a blog post, a message from a woman I'd never met. "Me too," she wrote. Then another. "I thought I was the only one." And another. "Thank you for saying what I've never been able to." I remember the first time I shared my story in a small online support group. I was shaking, I could barely type, but once I did, the messages started pouring in. Dozens, then hundreds. Stories like mine, stories worse than mine. And that's when I realized how deafening silence really is. How many of us are out there, holding on to pain that was never meant to be carried alone. Women who were taught that their voices were dangerous, that their questions meant rebellion, that their heartbreak was a sign of weak faith. But I know better now. Speaking is not rebellion, It's resistance, and resistance is sacred. Every time a woman tells the truth about what happened behind closed doors, another crack forms in the wall of fear that's kept us apart, and cracks, no matter how small. Let the light in. I began writing letters I never planned to send. To the elders, to the women who used to sit beside me at meetings, heads bowed in quiet submission, to the girl I used to be. Sometimes I burned them. Sometimes I folded them neatly and placed them in a drawer. But every word was a seed, and eventually, something began to grow. There were days I wanted to run back, not because I believed again, but because the loneliness was so loud, it felt like it might swallow me whole. I missed the structure, the certainty, even the rhythm of it all. But then I'd remember the cost. The girl who was shamed for her skirt. The boy who wept after being told God hated how he loved. The mother who was silenced for protecting her daughter. And I would sit with that, hold it like a stone in my hand. Because remembering isn't just pain, it's power. And I made a promise to myself. If I survived the silence, I wouldn't waste my voice. I started speaking out more, not on stages or platforms, but in quiet spaces, coffee shops, park benches, in the comment sections of strangers' posts, in phone calls that began with trembling voices and ended in tears. Sometimes I just listened. Sometimes I held a trembling hand in mine. Sometimes I said the words. I once needed someone to say to me, "You are not crazy. You are not evil. You were never the problem, because I know what it feels like to carry a truth so heavy it bends your spine. I know what it's like to scream into a void and hear nothing back but doctrine. And I know what it's like to question your own memory just because someone with a title told you God wouldn't approve. One day a woman messaged me. She had just left her congregation. She was terrified, alone, and unsure if she'd made the right decision. She asked me, "Does it get better?" I didn't lie to her. I told her there would be days she'd feel like a ghost in her own life. That the grief of leaving wasn't just about losing faith. It was about losing a version of yourself you thought would last forever. But I also told her about the first time I felt the sun on my face without guilt. About the sound of my son laughing at a birthday party I finally let him have. About the moment I stood in a mirror and didn't see shame, but strength. Because healing isn't a straight path. It's messy. It loops. It stings. But it also frees. That woman? She kept messaging me. And then, one day, she messaged someone else. And they messaged another. Until slowly, a chain began to form. A network of women who refused to let silence win. We shared resources, shared hugs, shared stories. And for the first time in my life, I felt what real sisterhood was. Not the kind that depends on submission or hierarchy, but one born from truth and fire. I didn't need a title to lead. I just needed to survive long enough to light a match. And once I did, I watched the darkness retreat. I began to write again. Not just letters I'd never send, but essays, blog posts, even poetry. Words poured out of me like floodwaters, rushing, chaotic, and long overdue. It wasn't just therapy. It was reclamation. For years I had been a vessel for someone else's truth. I had memorized the Watchtower's language, internalized the right phrases, trained my voice to match the tone of obedience. I knew how to suppress myself so well, I almost forgot there was a me underneath it all. But now, with each word I wrote, I was unburying her. And she wasn't meek. She wasn't passive. She was furious. She was brave. She had questions. And this time, she wasn't afraid of the answers. Some nights I stayed up until 2 or 3 a.m., just sitting in the stillness, rereading old journals from my teenage years. I found pages filled with prayers I'd written, begging Jehovah to make me clean, to help me stop doubting, to erase the parts of me that didn't fit. Reading them now broke my heart, not because I was ashamed of that girl, but because I could finally see how hard she was trying to be lovable in a system that only rewarded obedience. There's a kind of mourning that comes with realizing how much of your life was shaped by fear. I mourned the birthdays I missed, the friendships I pushed away, the woman I might have been had I been allowed to grow without a leash around my heart. But I didn't let that grief drown me. Instead, I let it teach me. I began hosting small meetups, just a few women at a time. We'd gather in someone's living room or at the edge of a park. No formal structure, no preaching, just stories. And every time a new woman spoke, I saw myself in her. Not the same details, not the same pain, but the same ache behind the eyes, the same longing to be seen without being judged, to be held without conditions. One woman told us she hadn't spoken out loud in a group since being disfellowshipped 20 years ago. Another said she didn't even know who she was without the congregation's identity to anchor her. And we listened, we cried, and we laughed, really laughed, for the first time in ages. Because even in the rubble, joy finds a way. That's what no one tells you when you leave. Yes, it's hard. Yes, it hurts. But freedom is not just the absence of chains. It's the presence of breath. And I was finally breathing again. The first time I walked past a Kingdom Hall after leaving, I felt my knees weaken. It wasn't even my old congregation. It was just a generic building, brick walls and modest signage. But my body reacted like it had seen a ghost. My heart pounded. My mouth went dry. And then I laughed, not because it was funny, but because of how deep the conditioning ran. How a place could trigger such a visceral response, even when I no longer believed in what was preached inside. I stood there for a while, across the street, just watching. A few families trickled in. Suits, dresses, Bibles in hand. I recognized the rhythm, the choreography, the polite nods, the quiet urgency to appear spiritual. And for a moment I envied them. Not because I wanted that life again, but because it was easier. There's a strange comfort in not having to think for yourself, in outsourcing your morality to someone who swears they have divine authority. But I had made a vow. No more silence, no more pretending. So I turned away. I went home and wrote about it, every sensation, every memory it stirred. And I posted it, not anonymously, not quietly. I signed my name. It felt like setting fire to a bridge and watching the smoke rise with no intention of turning back. That post reached thousands of people. Some thanked me, others challenged me. A few accused me of exaggerating, of seeking attention. But the overwhelming response was solidarity. So many women, so many people had stories like mine, not identical, but parallel. Stories of religious trauma disguised as love, of obedience taught as salvation, of silence demanded as proof of faith. I began receiving emails, letters, voicemails from strangers who said they'd never told anyone before. But after reading my words, they felt brave enough to begin. That was when I realized telling my truth wasn't just for me anymore. It was for the ones still trapped inside the cycle, for the teenage girls begging God to fix them, for the mothers biting their tongues in fear of losing their children, for the quiet rebels who sit through every meeting, screaming on the inside but smiling on the outside. It was for all of them, and I would not stop, even if my old congregation called it rebellion, even if my family never spoke to me again, even if I had to walk this path alone, because I knew now Freedom is lonely, but it is honest, and I would choose truth over comfort every time. After that post went viral, something shifted in me, something irreversible. For the first time in my life, I wasn't reacting. I wasn't hiding. I wasn't shrinking myself to fit someone else's definition of righteous. I was living fully and unapologetically in the open. But with truth came consequence. My parents stopped calling, no warning, no explanation, just silence. Like I'd vanished from their world the moment I stopped believing in theirs. My sister blocked me on every platform. A childhood friend, someone I once considered a sister in spirit, sent a single message before disappearing. "You've been misled. I'm praying for you." It hurt. I won't pretend it didn't. But there was also a strange kind of peace in it. Like finally shedding a skin I had outgrown decades ago. Like standing in the middle of a storm and realizing, you've survived worse. I filled my days differently now. I joined a support group for survivors of high-control religions. We met in a coffee shop once a week. It was messy, raw, and beautiful. Some were angry, some were grieving, some just needed someone to look them in the eye and say, "You're not crazy." I clung to those meetings like lifelines. There, I wasn't a label, not apostate, not fallen, just grace. A woman learning how to breathe without permission. One evening, a young woman, barely 20, shared her story for the first time. Her voice cracked with every word. She'd just left, and her entire family had cut her off. She said she wasn't sure she'd made the right choice, that maybe she should go back, apologize, beg for forgiveness, even if it meant pretending again. No one interrupted. We let her speak, let her cry. And when she finished, I looked her in the eyes and said, "I've been where you are." I know how it feels to question your own voice after years of being told it's dangerous. But let me tell you something. I reached across the table, my hand over hers. You don't have to go back to pain just because it's familiar. She broke down, and I held her hand until the cafe closed. That night, I sat in my car, exhausted but clear. This was my ministry now. Not knocking on doors, not reading from a watchtower, but showing up, listening, witnessing. Truthfully, lovingly, without judgment. I no longer believed in the God they taught me to worship, but I did believe in redemption. Not the kind that comes after death, but the kind you fight for while you're still alive. The kind that comes from reclaiming your voice. The kind that happens when one broken woman reaches out to another and says, "I see you. I believe you. And I'm still standing. You will too." As time passed, I stopped looking over my shoulder. I stopped scanning the crowd for familiar faces who might report back to the elders. I stopped apologizing for the space I occupied. But healing isn't linear. Some days the grief hits me like a wave out of nowhere. A smell, a song, the sound of children knocking on doors 2 blocks away. And suddenly, I'm that little girl again, standing perfectly still in a dress too stiff, smiling because I was told the smile mattered more than the truth behind it. I've learned to sit with those memories, not push them away, not drown them out, but welcome them like old friends with stories to tell. I started journaling every morning, just 5 minutes, nothing fancy. Some entries are a mess, some are just one word. Why? But over time, that journaling became a mirror, one that showed me not who I was told to be, but who I was becoming. Free, messy, real. I also began reconnecting with parts of life I was taught to fear. I went to my first birthday party. At 34. I laughed so hard my ribs hurt. I bought a small Christmas tree and cried as I strung the lights. Not because I believed in the holiday, but because it was mine now. My choice, my ritual, my rebellion. And then came the biggest moment. My son, now in middle school, came home one day and said, "Mom, I told my teacher that you're the bravest person I know." I froze, not because I needed the praise, but because it meant he saw me, not as a woman who left everything behind, but as a woman who chose truth. I didn't cry in front of him. I just hugged him longer than usual. But later that night, I sat in the dark, letting that sentence replay in my mind like a hymn. "You're the bravest person I know." It hit me then. This journey I'd been on wasn't just mine. It was his, too. Because every choice I made to heal, to speak, to stand up, echoed in the life I was building for him. And that's when I knew. This story wasn't just about survival. It was about legacy. Not the one written in scriptures or enforced by elders, but the one etched in the quiet courage of everyday defiance, of showing up for yourself, of reclaiming your voice, of becoming the kind of ancestor your children can thank in silence. I used to think that faith meant obedience, that trust in God meant silence, that being good meant disappearing behind a smile, even when your heart was breaking. But I've come to understand something deeper, something I wish someone had told me when I was a child. Faith isn't quiet. It's fierce. It's not about folding yourself into someone else's mold. It's about standing in your own skin, trembling maybe, but still standing. It's about asking hard questions, even when the answers hurt. It's about loving with your whole being, even when your voice shakes. I still believe in something greater than myself, but now that belief is built on honesty, on integrity, on the sacred act of telling the truth, even when it costs everything. I believe in the God who sees me, not the one who demanded my silence. I believe in the kind of community where love doesn't require erasure, where stories like mine aren't hidden in the shadows, where women are not just heard, but believed. These days I share my story whenever I can, sometimes with strangers, sometimes with women who pull me aside, eyes wide and wet, whispering, "Me too." And every time I tell them, "You're not broken, you're not crazy, you're not alone," because I know what it feels like to think you're the only one, to carry your past like a secret weapon, always bracing for the next wound. But there is power in naming the pain, power in standing up, power in choosing your own voice over their version of your story. I don't need a platform. I don't need a pulpit. I just need a quiet room and someone willing to listen. Because that's how healing begins. One voice, one truth, one sacred act of remembering. If you've made it this far, thank you. Not just for hearing me, but for staying, for sitting with this story, even when it hurt, even when the silence between my words said more than the words themselves. Thank you for honoring that silence, for honoring me. For most of my life, I believed my voice didn't matter. I was told that obedience was strength, that submission was faith, and that silence was a virtue. I believed that if I just stayed quiet long enough, maybe the questions would disappear. Maybe the pain would become holy. But the truth is, it never did. The pain didn't go away. It just burrowed deeper. It became part of me. It changed the way I breathed, the way I walked, the way I looked at myself in the mirror. And for years I blamed myself. I thought I was the problem, that I wasn't faithful enough, that if I could just pray harder, serve more, be quieter, the heaviness would lift. But now I see it clearly. The problem wasn't my voice. The problem was the system that taught me to fear it. Doubt isn't betrayal. It's the beginning of wisdom. grief isn't weakness. It's the shadow of love. And silence may have protected their power, but breaking it is what saved my life. Some days I still feel the weight of those teachings. I still hear the echoes of old judgments, words that told me who I was allowed to be and what I was forbidden to feel. There are nights I dream I'm back in that hall, surrounded by faces that never really saw me, with my mouth sewn shut and my heart screaming behind my ribs. But then I wake up. I go to the kitchen. I make my coffee. I watch my child play. I feel the sunlight on my face. And I remember, I survived. Not just the meetings or the dogma or the fear. I survived the slow erasure of myself. I survived the years spent molding my soul into someone else's idea of holy. And because I survived, I speak. Not to convince, not to condemn, but to offer my voice as proof that healing is possible, that faith can look different, that truth doesn't belong to institutions. It lives inside the ones brave enough to seek it. So if you're watching this with a heaviness in your chest, holding a truth you've never dared to speak, know this: you're not alone. Your story matters. And your voice, even if it trembles, is enough. You don't have to stay silent anymore. You're allowed to leave. You're allowed to feel. You're allowed to begin again. And whatever pieces of you survived the silence, I hope you build something beautiful with them.